Hi, my name is Bill Braniff, and in this lecture we'll be delving deeper into one of the four characteristics of radicalization that we've already mentioned, ideology. Ideologies are specific belief systems that interpret grievances or interpret the world around oneself, assigns blame for the things that are wrong with the world, provides a vision for how that world should be, and most importantly, tells an individual what they can do or what they need to do in order to take the world from the way that it currently is to the way that it should be. Some characteristics that mark ideologies. They tend to be very black and white, sort of simplifications of a very complex world. And that's important because that black and white nature of an ideology allows a person to be decisive. Instead of being overwhelmed by the complexity of a given situation, they see right and wrong, black and white, and that allows them to take action. And again, that's an important aspect of an ideology. There's also typically a sense of timeliness or urgency with an ideology. It's not enough to understand how the world is and how the world should be, but that roadmap to action and that sense of urgent action is embedded in the ideology. Typically, if an ideology is espoused by a weaker party, there's this desire for change, to create change. If, on the other hand, the ideology is espoused by a stronger party, ideologies tend to be about resisting change, about maintaining the status quo, about preventing some future change that might be just around the corner. And then those who believe in an ideology typically believe that they have this exclusive knowledge that can be useful to elevate mankind or even to save mankind. If it's a religious ideology, they have this exclusive knowledge to instill God's will on earth. But it's this idea of an exclusive knowledge. And so it can be a fringe set of beliefs and yet be held to very fervently because those who believe it feel like they're the only ones who have this really important information. And ideologies, therefore, they tend to be about generating fervor. Persuasion is more important than factual accuracies. And this is just important to mention because, of course, when you think about countering an ideology, it suggests that countering an ideology based on presenting more or different facts is probably not going to be that persuasive. Because, again, ideologies are meant to create belief, faith, fervor. A few examples of ideologies that are typically espoused by terrorist organizations, and this is certainly not a comprehensive list, include things like separatism. The idea that an existing body of people wants autonomy or they want to be separate from the powers that be. Separatism became very important after the end of World War I, and we saw a lot of anti-imperial terrorist organizations or anti-colonial terrorist organizations emerge with separatist ideologies. Ethno-nationalism is a second ideology that we could talk about. This is the idea of creating a nation-state based on one's ethno-national or ethno-linguistic identity. The Basques in Spain are a good example of an ethno-nationalist group. There are racist ideologies, which claim that members of one's race are superior to members of another's race, and that there shouldn't be integration between the two, and in some cases even that because of this elevated status of one race over the other, that the other should be subjugated or persecuted or even killed based on their racial identity. Ideologies are important for several reasons. First, they can help to polarize society, to create an us versus them mentality or an in-group and an out-group mentality. And that can help recruitment and radicalization. That can also help mobilization of resources for a terrorist organization that seeks to advance that ideology. Ideologies also frequently serve to define the parameters of violence that a given terrorist organization will use. So, for example, what kinds of targets are warranted or eligible for being attacked? What kind of tactics are acceptable and what kind of tactics are not acceptable? Even the timing of an attack can be dictated by the contours of an ideology. So, for example, an environmental group that believes that animals should not be killed in support of research may not use murder as a tactic when trying to intimidate others to see the world the way they do, because if they're campaigning against the murder of animals, the murder of a human may be hypocritical and counterproductive. Ideology also helps to shape propaganda. what images does the organization use? What music, what symbols or words are invoked to arouse emotions in the viewers or the receivers of that propaganda? But it's not just propaganda that can serve as a vehicle to disseminate an ideology. Uh, Indoctrinated veterans of a group or movement also become powerful carriers of an ideology, and they can help to spread it to different regions or to different communities. A good example of this is detailed in Dr. Asaf Moghadam's book, The Globalization of Martyrdom. And he argues in this book that the drastic rise in the frequency of suicide bombing as a terrorist tactic can be tied or correlated to the dissemination of Al-Qaeda's violent jihadist ideology, that as that ideology spread, a tactic came with it. And the way that tactic typically spread is through both propaganda dissemination as well as individual veterans of Al-Qaeda's conflicts traveling to new conflict zones and bringing with them that set of beliefs, including the set of behaviors that support those beliefs. Let's take for an example the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL. This is an organization with a long and complicated history, but suffice it to say for now, they emerged out of the global jihadist community more broadly. They grew to prominence in the mid-2000s during the U.S. occupation of Iraq as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And then the organization sort of moved the locus of its activity up into Syria during the Syrian civil war, and at that point in time had a splinter or a falling out with Al-Qaeda, their former affiliate, and really became their own entity. Broadly speaking, ISIL believes that violence is necessary to destabilize the illegitimate regimes that govern the Muslim world in their minds, and then replace the void left when those regimes are destabilized with their interpretation of Islamic law. More specifically, however, there are several important components of ISIL's ideology. The first is their believed need to purify Islam of false beliefs and false practices. And this is important as an ideological precept because it leads to a certain kind of operational preferences. They target the Shia, so sectarian violence against the Shia Muslim community in these places. They also target other non-Muslim communities. We've heard of attacks against the Yazidis, attacks against Christians. This kind of internecine violence within Iraq and Syria further destabilizes and polarizes those communities. It also leads to a general escalation of violence because unlike a group like Al-Qaeda, which is only targeting the far enemy, the West, the United States, ISIL's ideology leads it to target those communities that are close to home, and it allows for much larger numbers of people involved in the conflict. ISIL also believes in reestablishing the caliphate. The caliphate is a political entity based on Islam as opposed to the modern nation-state model, the post-Westphalian model in the Western world, and really the nation-state model that has been true in the Muslim world since the end of World War I. The Islamic State instead believes that by reestablishing the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, they have created an obligation for Muslims the world over to flock to Iraq and Syria or to the caliphate to build its institutions and to expand its boundaries. In addition to the sense of obligation, they believe in the imminence of an end of days apocalyptic battle between the Muslim community and the non-Muslim world. This creates a sense of urgency for would-be recruits. The logic, of course, is that because of the imminence of this apocalyptic battle, if one doesn't mobilize, if one doesn't join the fight now, you might miss the opportunity. And once you've missed that opportunity, you'll never have a chance to take part in it again, and you'll miss out on all the rewards and the honor that would go with participating in that battle. ISIL has also really focused on their strength. Al-Qaeda, by contrast, has often talked about the strength of the enemy and that it's very important to be cautious and deliberate when attacking the far enemy. A group like ISIL has been brash and bold. They've seized terrain, they've seized banks, they've seized dams, they've seized oil infrastructure. They've taunted the West with certain kinds of attacks. And this creates a sense of empowerment and a sense of pride in would-be recruits. And finally, ISIL has an extreme focus on action as opposed to intellectual pursuits. So whereas Al-Qaeda might have venerated the scholars of the violent jihadist movement, ISIL venerates the fighters, the people in the trenches, the people actually engaged in combat as the spokespersons for Islam. As I mentioned, ideology is not just good for mobilizing resources, as I've just described. It is also exported, and therefore it can shape the violence in distant places and in distant communities. ISIL's ideology is exported through its propaganda, of course, just like other terrorist organizations, but they've also really focused on social media platforms. And these social media platforms allow a group like ISIL or members of ISIL to engage in a very intimate one-on-one dialogue with individual recruits or adherents elsewhere in the world, maybe part of another conflict or in a country like the United States or a Western European country. And they can encourage them to become foreign fighters to join the fight through those social media platforms. And importantly, ISIL's propaganda is not the only way that the ideology is exported, but it's also exported by veterans of the conflict themselves who leave Iraq and Syria and who might go to the next conflict zone. And when they go to the next conflict zone, they're not just bringing the ideas or the belief system of the Islamic State, but they're also bringing with them the resulting tactics and targeting preferences that we mentioned, this idea about sectarian violence, about escalating and destabilizing kinds of attacks. And this, of course, bodes very poorly for any conflict that might be the recipient of veterans from ISIL's conflicts in Iraq and Syria. So what we've talked about is the idea that ideologies are roadmaps to action, that they are not just about a set of beliefs, but they're a set of beliefs that shape behaviors, and that there's not just a one-way system where you have a creative narrative and that brings in raw resources or raw materials, but that because the ideology helps shape those raw materials in the conflict zone, when they're exported, they become carriers of that ideology and can therefore infect the next conflict zone with that same ideology.